To the casual tourist standing on Westminster Bridge, Big Ben is merely a postcard backdrop, a giant golden clock that tells the time. But for those who lean into the history of the Nostalgia Brit, it is something far more profound. It is not just a timekeeper, it is a social contract forged in iron and bronze. The true magic of Big Ben lies in its imperfections. Most people assume its deep, resonant E-natural note is a feat of perfect Victorian engineering. In reality, the chime we recognize today is the sound of a mistake. In 1859, shortly after installation, the great bell cracked because the striking hammer was twice as heavy as it should have been. Instead of replacing it, engineers simply turned the bell 90 degrees and cut a small square in the rim to stop the crack from spreading. That flaw is what gives the bell its unique, slightly somber overtone. There is a psychological lesson here. We don't love Big Ben because it is perfect, we love it because it has a voice, and a voice requires character, which often comes from a scar. In our modern era, we are governed by the silent, sterile accuracy of atomic clocks on our smartphones. Time has become private and fragmented. But in the 19th century, Big Ben was a communal experience. It synchronized an entire empire. When the BBC first broadcast its chimes on New Year's Eve in 1923, it did something revolutionary. It allowed a person in a remote village in Scotland to share the exact same second as a businessman in the City of London. It turned time from a local guess into a national heartbeat. There is a logic-defying truth about this tower. Theoretically, it should be obsolete. We have no practical need for a 13.7-ton bell to tell us it's noon. Yet when the bell went silent for maintenance in 2017, a strange anxiety settled over London. It felt as though the city's internal rhythm had been disrupted. This brings us to a perspective few consider. Big Ben isn't there to tell us what time it is, it's there to tell us that time is still moving. In a world where political regimes fall and technology renders itself redundant every 6 months, the 160-year-old thud of the great bell is a rare anchor of continuity.
I often think about my own grandfather, who lived through the Blitz. He once told me that during the darkest nights of the 1940s, hearing that chime on the radio was the only proof he had that London hadn't been levelled to the ground. It wasn't about the hour, it was about survival. But before this giant could become the guardian of British spirit, it had to be born from a literal inferno. To understand the soul of the tower, we have to go back to the night when the old world burned down to make room for the new. Symbols aren't usually born in tranquility, they are forged in chaos. The anchor that would become Big Ben was conceived in the devastating inferno of 1834, a fire so severe it annihilated the medieval Palace of Westminster. As the ancient oak beams crashed into the Thames, they made room for a different kind of vision, a statement of Victorian supremacy disguised as a clock tower. This brings us to a crucial human conflict. We tend to think of monumental projects as products of smooth collaboration, but Big Ben was the child of a bitter, tragic rivalry. On one side was Charles Barry, the overarching architect of the new Parliament, who championed the neo-Gothic style not merely for its aesthetics, but because it represented an inherently British identity, distinct from the classical architecture favoured by continental rivals like France. But Barry was not a clockmaker, nor a detailed artist. For that, he relied on Augustus Pugin. This is where the story gets heartbreaking. Pugin, a tortured genius, designed every intricate detail of the 4 clock faces. His logic was that beauty was a prerequisite for functionality, and the clock had to be a sermon in stone and glass. However, while he was drafting these masterpieces, his own mind was fracturing under the pressure and religious fervor. He designed one of the most recognized objects in the world while descending into irreversible madness. Pugin died in an asylum just as the tower was nearing completion, never living to see his creation tell the time. There is a melancholy truth here. The face that London stares at every day is the product of a mind that was falling apart.
But the real engineering war was fought over the tri-theme of the Cos machine. The Astronomer Royal George Airy set an impossible standard. The first stroke of the Great Bell must be accurate to within 1 second of the true time, every hour. Every established master clockmaker of London scoffed at this. They argued that environmental variables, the winds from the Thames, the humidity, the vibration of the traffic, made that degree of precision mathematically impossible for a mechanical clock. Enter Edmund Beckett Denison. He was a barrister by trade, not a clockmaker, and that was precisely why he succeeded. He wasn't constrained by the traditional dogmas of the trade. If the existing logic said it was impossible, Denison decided the logic was wrong. He invented the Grimthorpe escapement, a revolutionary mechanism that isolated the pendulum from external forces. His case proves that sometimes disruptive innovation comes not from the expert, but from the obsessed amateur who refuses to accept no for an answer. Yet, despite this technical triumph, the tower remained empty. For 8 years after Denison perfected the mechanism, they couldn't get the actual ben to work. The first great bell, cast in 1856, was defective and cracked immediately. The second one, the one still in the tower, was cast in 1858 and required 16 horses to pull it over the bridge to Westminster. It too cracked, but, as we discussed, they found a workaround. When it finally chimed for the first time in July 1859, it didn't just represent the time, it was the victory lap of a nation that had subdued fire, defied madness, and forced mechanics to bend to the human will. It was a 200-foot-high assertion that Victorian Britain could measure the universe more accurately than anyone else. But before this symbol could mature, it would face its greatest challenge, becoming the keeper of a memory that was rapidly fading. In our hyper-digital 2026, we are obsessed with smart things. We want our watches to track our heart rate and our phones to sync with satellites. But the most reliable clock in the world, the one that hasn't missed a beat through 2 world wars, is essentially a giant Victorian pile of gears adjusted by pocket change.
If you were to climb the 334 stone steps to the belfry, you wouldn't find a computer motherboard or a fiber optic cable. Instead, you would find a stack of old pre-decimal copper pennies. This is the penny trick, and it is perhaps the most British piece of engineering in existence. To understand the logic, you have to look at the physics of the pendulum. The speed of the clock is determined by the length of that pendulum. If it's too long, it swings slower. If it's too short, it swings faster. Instead of using a digital dial, the keepers of the clock simply add or remove a single penny on the pendulum's shaft. Adding 1 19th century penny raises the center of mass by an infinitesimal fraction, effectively shortening the pendulum. The result? The clock speeds up by exactly 0.4 seconds per day. There is something profoundly humbling about the fact that the time of a global superpower is balanced on the weight of a few discarded coins. It's a middle finger to the concept of planned obsolescence. While your latest smartphone will be e-waste in 5 years, these pennies have been doing their job since the 1850s. But the tower has another secret, one that isn't about time, but about power. At the very top, above the bells, sits the Ayrton light. Most Londoners see it as just another street lamp in the sky, but its history is rooted in the specific demands of a queen. In 1885, Queen Victoria grew tired of wondering if her parliament was actually working or if they had all gone home to their estates. She ordered a light to be installed that would only shine when the House of Commons or the House of Lords was in session after dark. Named after Ayrton Smee Ayrton, the first Commissioner of Works, the light was a 19th century Reed receipt. It was the ultimate "I'm watching you" from the monarch to the politicians. Today, it still functions as a visual beacon of democracy. If that light is on, the laws of the land are being debated. If it's off, the city sleeps.
The logic-defying part of this story: we often assume that as technology advances, the human element should disappear. We think a computer could do a better job of managing Big Ben. But during the 1976 Great Breakdown, the worst mechanical failure in its history, it wasn't a software patch that saved the clock. It was the intuition of engineers who could hear the metal fatigue before the gears shattered. There is a lesson here for us. True reliability isn't found in the newest sensor, but in the things we can touch, wait, and hear. We trust Big Ben because it is physically connected to the world. It feels the wind, it reacts to the weight of a penny, and it shines only when humans are at work. It's an analog anchor in a digital storm. Yet, for all its technical quirks, Big Ben's true test wasn't against the laws of physics, but against the laws of war. To see the clock as a symbol of defiance, we have to look at the years when it became the only voice left in a city under fire. If Part 3 was about the clock's mechanical soul, Part 4 is about its psychological armor. There is a common misconception that Big Ben survived the Second World War because it was an impenetrable fortress of stone. In reality, the Elizabeth Tower is surprisingly fragile, a giant hollow chimney filled with delicate glass and precision gears. It survived not because it was indestructible, but because the British people refused to let it die. The defining moment occurred on the night of May 10th, 1941. This was the final, most brutal night of the Blitz. A German high-explosive bomb plummeted through the roof of the House of Commons, reducing the debating chamber to a charred skeleton of twisted metal. Another bomb struck the Elizabeth Tower itself, shattering the glass of the south clock face and mangling the ornate stonework of the roof. The logic of war suggested the clock should stop. The vibration alone should have knocked the pendulum off its rhythm. But as the sun rose over a smoke-choked London the next morning, the great bells struck the hour, exactly on time. This wasn't just a technical fluke, it was a psychological counterattack. To the millions of Londoners emerging from their underground shelters, that sound was the only data point that mattered. It proved that the heart of the nation was still beating.
There was a specific ritualized power to this. During the war, the BBC began broadcasting the chimes live. A man named Wellesley Tudor Pole initiated the Big Ben Silent Minute. At 9 p.m. every night, as the chimes rang out, Britons were encouraged to observe 60 seconds of silence. It was a moment of collective consciousness, a bridge of sound connecting the soldier in North Africa to the mother in a London basement. It transformed a Victorian clock into a spiritual antenna. However, there is a lighter, almost absurdist side to this narrative that exposes the fragility I mentioned earlier. If Nazi bombs couldn't stop Big Ben, what could? The answer, quite literally, was a handful of feathers. In August 1944, and again in 1949, the clock famously slowed down by 4.5 minutes. The engineers were baffled.
Had the mechanism finally given up? No. Upon inspection, they found that a massive flock of starlings had decided to use the 4-meter-long minute hand as a convenient perch. The collective weight of several hundred birds was enough to overpower the Victorian gears. There is a profound, almost poetic irony here. The Luftwaffe, with all its industrial might, couldn't silence the bell, but a group of small, migratory birds did. It reminds us that while we build monuments to withstand the big tragedies of history, it is often the tiny, overlooked details of nature and human error that truly disrupt us. Some historians argue that the stiff upper lip associated with Big Ben is a manufactured myth, a piece of wartime propaganda. I disagree. I believe the connection is more visceral. When we face a crisis, our brains desperately seek a constant, something that doesn't change when everything else is in flux. For a generation under fire, Big Ben was that constant. I think of the story of an old watchmaker I once met in Clerkenwell. He told me that during the war, people didn't check their watches to see if they were late. They checked them against Big Ben to see if the world was still on track. That is a level of trust no digital algorithm can ever replicate.
But even symbols need to rest. As the decades rolled on, the coal smoke of the 20th century began to choke the gears, and the great bell entered a period of silence that nearly broke the city's spirit once again. In August 2017, a strange, heavy silence fell over Westminster. For the first time in generations, the great bell was stilled for a massive 5-year conservation project. To the cynic, spending £80 million to repair a Victorian clock tower in an era of satellites and atomic time seemed like an expensive indulgence. But as the scaffolding rose, we realized we weren't just cleaning a building. We were performing a coronary bypass on the heart of London. The restoration revealed a strange, heavy silence about our own memory. For over a century, the world believed Big Ben's clock faces were black and gold. We grew up with that somber industrial aesthetic. However, when historians began stripping away layers of paint and London's thick pea super soot, they found something shocking. The original colour chosen by Augustus Pugin in 1859 was a vibrant, regal Prussian blue. This discovery serves as a metaphor for history itself. We often view the past through a dark, grainy lens, assuming it was a world of shadows. In reality, the Victorians lived in a world of high-definition colour. By restoring the blue, we didn't change the clock, we corrected our own faulty memory. Every one of the 1,296 pieces of glass on the 4 clock faces was replaced with hand-blown glass, crafted by the same traditional methods used 160 years ago. There is no shortcut to authenticity. There is a fascinating logic to why we still need this tower in 2026. In our current world, we are drowning in virtual reality and AI-generated content. We can simulate anything, but we can't simulate the physical vibration of 13.7 tons of bronze striking the air. When the bells finally rang out again to mark the return to full service, the sound felt thicker than any digital recording. It was a reminder that some things must be physical to be real.
I remember watching the scaffolding come down section by section. It felt like watching an old friend recover from a long illness. A retired engineer once told me that he used to time his walks to the sound of the bell, not because he didn't have a watch, but because the bell was the official version of reality. If his watch disagreed with Big Ben, his watch was wrong. That is the ultimate definition of an anchor. Today, as we stand on the bridge and look up at the Prussian blue and the gleaming gold leaf, we aren't just looking at a clock, we are looking at a witness. Big Ben has seen the rise and fall of empires, the invention of the internet, and now the dawn of the AI age.
It remains the great constant. It tells us that while the years may change our technology and our politics, the fundamental human need for a shared rhythm, a communal heartbeat, remains untouched. As the sun sets over the Thames, reflecting off the newly polished dials, the message of the Nostalgia Brit is clear. We don't look back to live in the past. We look back to find the solid ground we need to walk into the future.